High in the Montana Rockies, Ellie bought an abandoned train car at auction for just $500. The locals thought she was insane. No one bid against her, and their pitying stares followed her out of the courthouse. The rusted hulk sat forgotten on a remote siding, shrouded in decades of neglect and whispered warnings. But when her rescue dog, a grey and white German shepherd named Ranger, refused to leave the car's sealed cargo hold, scratching frantically at the rusted lock with desperate urgency, Ellie knew this was no ordinary purchase. Inside, hidden beneath rotting floorboards, she found a weathered leather satchel, and the discovery inside would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family's past. What secret had been locked away in that forgotten train car for so many years? Why were powerful people suddenly so interested in what she'd found? And what would they do to keep the truth buried forever? The air inside the Flathead County auction house was thick with the smell of old wood, stale coffee, and something else Ellie Harper couldn't quite name. A scent that reminded her of the waiting rooms where she used to counsel families in crisis, the smell of anxiety and secrets kept too long. She sat near the back on a hard folding chair, her posture deliberately relaxed, though her blue eyes were alert, scanning the room with the practiced observation of someone who had spent years reading the unspoken language of human distress. At 34, Ellie was lean and quietly strong, her dark brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, dressed in practical jeans, a warm flannel shirt, and sturdy hiking boots that'd seen better days. She had come to Montana 3 weeks ago with nothing but a backpack, a broken heart from years of absorbing other people's trauma, and Ranger, the grey and white German shepherd, who now sat calmly at her feet, his intelligent amber eyes mirroring her watchful demeanor. The auction had been moving along with the typical rhythm of small-town commerce, locals bidding on farm equipment, furniture from estate sales, and repossessed vehicles, the hands shooting up with familiar gestures and good-natured competition. But when the auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a face like weathered granite, cleared his throat and announced Lot 47, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, and the comfortable noise of shuffling feet and whispered conversations died into an oppressive silence. An abandoned railway cargo car on Mountain Siding 7, located approximately 40 miles northeast of town, accessible by Forestry Road, sold as is. No warranties, no inspections, the auctioneer droned, his voice notably lacking the enthusiasm he had shown for the previous lots, and Ellie noticed how his eyes didn't quite meet anyone's gaze as he spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, and Ellie watched as neighbors who had been bidding aggressively moments before suddenly found their shoes fascinating, their faces carefully, neutral, but their body language screaming warnings she couldn't yet decode. "We'll start the bidding at $500, the auctioneer said, with the tone of a man fulfilling an unpleasant obligation, and when no hands rose, he sighed and prepared to move on. Ellie's hand went up, almost of its own accord, driven by an instinct she didn't fully understand, perhaps the same instinct that had once made her a good social worker, the ability to see value in abandoned things. "500, she said clearly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. The auctioneer's gavel came down with startling speed, sold to the lady in the back, as if he wanted to be rid of the responsibility as quickly as possible, and Ellie felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her, their expressions a mixture of pity, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. As she walked to the front to complete the paperwork, an elderly woman in a faded blue dress caught her sleeve and whispered, "You don't know what you just bought, child," before hurrying away, and the clerk who processed her payment refused to meet her eyes, pushing the deed across the counter as if the paper itself might burn her fingers, and Ellie left the auction house with a strange, hollow feeling in her chest. Ranger pressed protectively against her leg, both of them stepping out into the bright Montana sunlight, carrying the weight of a purchase that the entire town seemed to believe was a curse, though none of them would say why. The diner was called Martha's Place, a small weathered building with peeling red paint and a neon sign that flickered uncertainly in the afternoon light, and Ellie pushed through the door, with Ranger at her side, the bell above jangling to announce their arrival to the half-dozen customers scattered across the worn vinyl booths. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted, became quieter, more guarded, and Ellie felt the now familiar weight of suspicious stares following her to a corner booth where she could sit with her back to the wall, an old habit from her years working in crisis intervention. Martha herself came to take the order, a woman who had to be in her late 70s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and eyes that held the sharp, knowing quality of someone who had seen the full measure of human nature and was no longer surprised by any of it. "Coffee and the roast beef sandwich," Ellie said, and then, because the silence in the diner felt like it was waiting for something, she added, "I just bought lot 47 at the auction, the old train car up on Mountain Siding 7. Martha's weathered hand, which had been scribbling on her order pad, went completely still, and for a long moment the old woman simply stared at Ellie with an expression that cycled through surprise, concern, and finally a kind of resigned sadness. "Child," Martha said quietly, setting down her pad and sliding into the booth across from Ellie with the familiarity of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. "You've stepped into something that this town has been trying to forget for more than 30 years, and there are people, powerful people, who would very much prefer it stayed forgotten." The train car belonged to the old Rocky Mountain Rail Company, back when this whole valley depended on the railway for everything: jobs, commerce, connection to the outside world. Martha continued, her voice low enough that the other customers couldn't hear, but her words carrying the weight of long-held truth. That particular car was used for secure transport, valuable cargo, company documents, things that weren't meant for public eyes. And in 1963, something happened up on that siding, something the company covered up so thoroughly that most folks who remember are too scared to talk about it, and those who weren't scared are long dead. Martha's eyes drifted to the window, looking out at the mountains that ringed the valley, like ancient sentinels. There was a woman involved, a railway clerk who was asking questions she shouldn't have been asking, and then one day she just vanished, disappeared without a trace, and the train car got sealed up and abandoned, left to rot on that siding, like a tombstone nobody wanted to read. Over the years, different companies, developers, powerful interests from outside the valley, they've all tried to buy that land, acquire it quietly through shell companies and legal maneuvers, but something always stops them. Some quirk in the county land laws, some complication with the title, as if the land itself doesn't want to be claimed by the wrong hands. Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "The Hale family, they're the ones who really want it, have wanted it for decades. Richard Hale, who owns half the county now, his grandfather Vincent built the family fortune on the railway, and there are whispers, just whispers, mind you, that the fortune wasn't built as honestly as the history books claim." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warmth of the diner, her social worker instincts recognizing the pattern of a community conspiracy, of silence, the kind that protected abusers and buried victims. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, "when nobody else would even look at me at the auction?" Martha stood up slowly, her joints creaking with age, and looked down at Ellie with something that might have been respect, or might have been pity. "Because you remind me of her, of the woman who disappeared. Catherine Harper was her name. She had that same look in her eyes, like she couldn't walk away from something wrong, even when walking away was the smart thing to do. And maybe, just maybe, after 30 years, it's time someone finally looked in that train car and found out what really happened up on that mountain. Even if the truth comes with a price, this town isn't sure it wants to pay." The drive up to Mountain Siding 7 was a test of both Ellie's nerves and her aging truck's suspension, the forestry road deteriorating with each mile into little more than 2 muddy ruts carved through dense pine forest, the branches scraping against the sides of her vehicle, like skeletal fingers trying to turn her back. She had left town just after dawn, the deed to her strange purchase folded in her jacket pocket, Martha's warnings echoing in her mind alongside the name that had struck her like a physical blow, Catherine Harper, the same surname as Ellie's own, though she had pushed the coincidence aside as she focused on navigating the treacherous switchbacks that climbed higher and higher into the mountains. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, his usual calm replaced by an alert tension, his ears pricked forward and his nose pressed against the window, as if he could smell something in the thin mountain air that Ellie's human senses couldn't detect. After nearly 2 hours of grinding upward through the wilderness, the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing, and there it was, emerging from the morning mist like a ghost ship sailing on rails that led nowhere. The train car sat alone on a short stretch of track that ended abruptly at a sheer cliff face, as if the railway had been building toward some destination and simply gave up, abandoning this single cargo car to the mercy of time and weather. It was larger than Ellie had imagined, a massive rectangle of rusted metal that had once been painted dark green, but was now a patchwork of oxidized orange and brown, its sides streaked with decades of rain and neglect, its wheels frozen in place by rust and encroaching vegetation. The isolation of the place was profound, overwhelming, a silence so complete that Ellie could hear her own heartbeat as she stepped out of the truck, the nearest sign of human civilization 40 miles of bad road behind her, nothing ahead but wilderness and the empty sky. Ranger leapt out after her, and immediately his behavior changed in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in Ellie's mind. The dog, who was normally so calm and disciplined, began to pace in tight circles around the train car, his body low to the ground, his tail held stiff and straight, a high-pitched whine emanating from his throat that she had only heard once before, in the basement of a house where they had found a missing child during her social work days. "Easy, boy," Ellie said, approaching the train car slowly, her boots squelching in the mud and moss that had overgrown what had once been the railway bed. But Ranger ignored her, continuing his frantic circling, pausing occasionally to scratch at the base of the car and whine with increasing urgency. The train car loomed above her, its presence somehow malevolent, despite being an inanimate object, and Ellie found herself thinking about Martha's words, about Catherine Harper, who had disappeared, about the sealed cargo and the powerful family that wanted this land. She walked the length of the car, noting how the main doors were rusted partially open, revealing an interior filled with rotting wooden debris and pools of stagnant water. But it was the far end that drew Ranger's obsessive attention, a cargo hold that was completely sealed, its door not just locked but welded shut from the outside with thick beads of metal that had oxidized but still held firm after 3 decades. Someone had wanted to keep something in or keep people out, and as Ellie stood in the shadow of that sealed door, Ranger pressing against her leg and whining with a desperation that bordered on panic, she felt the weight of all those years of silence, all those warnings, all that fear pressing down on her like the mist that clung to the mountain peaks, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever was hidden inside that sealed cargo hold was the reason Catherine Harper had disappeared, the reason the town lived in fear, and the reason her own life was about to become far more complicated than a simple escape to the wilderness could ever be. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the train car in harsh, unforgiving detail. Every patch of rust, every dent and scrape, telling a story of abandonment that Ellie was determined to read. She circled the entire structure methodically, her years of investigative social work training her to notice details others might miss, cataloguing everything from the faded company logo still barely visible on one side, Rocky Mountain Rail Co. in peeling letters, to the way certain sections of metal had weathered differently, suggesting they had been added or modified after the car's original construction. Most of the car was accessible in the way that all abandoned things eventually become accessible, time and weather having forced open doors that were never meant to stay closed, creating gaps in the metal skin where panels had rusted through, leaving windows into an interior that held nothing but debris, scattered papers turned to pulp by decades of rain, wooden crates that had rotted into unrecognizable shapes, and the pervasive smell of decay and stagnant water. But the rear cargo hold was different, fundamentally and deliberately different, and the more Ellie examined it, the more convinced she became that this was what Martha had been warning her about, what the town feared, what powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The door to this section was a heavy sliding panel, the kind designed to be locked from the outside with a massive padlock. But someone had gone far beyond a simple lock. They had welded the door shut with thick, deliberate beads of metal that ran the entire length of the seam, creating a seal that was meant to be permanent. Ellie ran her fingers along the welds, feeling their texture, noting how they had been applied with care and precision, not the hasty work of someone trying to hide something in a panic, but the methodical work of someone who had time, resources, and a very specific intention to ensure this cargo hold would never be opened again. The metal was old, oxidized to a deep orange-brown that matched the rest of the car's deterioration, suggesting these welds had been made decades ago, possibly right around the time Catherine Harper disappeared in 1963, and that timing felt significant in a way that made Ellie's pulse quicken. Ranger had not stopped his frantic behavior. If anything, his obsession with the sealed hold had intensified, and now he was pouring at the base of the door with such force that Ellie worried he would damage his paws on the rough metal. "Stop, Ranger! Enough!" she commanded, using the firm tone that usually brought immediate obedience. But the dog barely acknowledged her, continuing to scratch and whine, his nose pressed against the tiny gap between the door and the frame, sniffing with desperate intensity, as if he could smell something inside that drove him to distraction. Ellie had worked with service dogs during her years in social services, had seen search and rescue animals alert to the presence of survivors in collapsed buildings, and Ranger's behavior now reminded her of those moments, the single-minded focus of an animal who had detected something that his human companion couldn't perceive. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his trembling flank, feeling the tension in his muscles, the rapid beating of his heart. And she looked at the sealed door with new eyes, no longer seeing just a welded panel, but a deliberate act of concealment. "What's in there, boy?" she whispered, and Ranger turned to look at her, his amber eyes holding an urgency that was almost human in its intensity, before returning to his frantic pawing. The rational part of Ellie's mind suggested a dozen innocent explanations. The car had been used to transport hazardous materials and was sealed for safety. It contained company documents, too sensitive to destroy, but too dangerous to leave accessible. It was simply the one section of the car that hadn't deteriorated naturally, and Ranger was reacting to some animal smell, a den of raccoons or the lingering scent of decay. But the other part of her mind, the part that had learned to trust her instincts during years of investigating abuse and neglect, the part that had brought her to this mountain in the first place, that part knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever was behind that welded door was connected to Catherine Harper's disappearance, to the town's fear, to the Hale family's decades-long interest in acquiring this land, and standing there in the isolation of the mountain clearing, with only her agitated dog for company, Ellie made a decision that would change everything. She was going to open that sealed cargo hold. She was going to find out what had been hidden here for 30 years, and she was going to do it now, before anyone who might want to stop her knew what she intended. The cutting torch had been an afterthought when Ellie loaded her truck that morning, tossed into the bed, alongside a toolbox, work gloves, and a heavy-duty flashlight, the kind of equipment someone brings when they're not entirely sure what they'll find, but want to be prepared for anything. Now, as she positioned the blue flame against the first section of oxidized weld, she felt grateful for her habit of over-preparation, a trait that had served her well during years of home visits to clients in unpredictable situations. The work was slow, painstaking, and brutally physical, the old welds resisting her efforts with the stubbornness of metal that had fused over 3 decades of mountain weather. And Ellie's arms began to ache within the first hour, the protective goggles fogging with her breath in the cold air. Ranger had finally stopped his frantic pawing and now sat a few feet away, watching her work with an intensity that never wavered, his body quivering with barely restrained anticipation, occasionally letting out a soft whine when her progress seemed too slow for his liking. The sun climbed higher, and then began its descent, marking the passage of hours that Ellie spent crouched beside the train car, cutting through one section of weld, then another, the sharp smell of hot metal mixing with the clean scent of pine and the underlying mustiness that seemed to emanate from the sealed hold itself. Her back screamed in protest, her hands cramped around the torch, and twice she had to stop to refill the fuel tank. But she kept working with the same dogged determination that had once made her the social worker who wouldn't give up on the difficult cases, the ones other people had written off as hopeless. Finally, as the afternoon light began to take on the golden quality of approaching evening, the last section of weld gave way, with a sharp crack that echoed across the clearing, and Ellie set down the torch, pulled off her goggles, and gripped the edge of the heavy sliding door with both hands. The door resisted at first, frozen in place by decades of disuse, but then it moved, groaning like a creature waking from a long sleep, the sound setting off a cascade of protests from the ancient metal rollers as she hauled it sideways, inch by grudging inch. When the opening was finally wide enough to enter, a wave of air rushed out, not the fresh mountain breeze Ellie had expected, but something stale and cold and profoundly wrong, carrying the smell of old wood and metal, and something else she couldn't identify, something that made her step back involuntarily. Ranger had no such hesitation. The moment the gap was large enough, he shot through it like a grey and white missile, disappearing into the darkness of the cargo hold with a sharp bark that sounded almost triumphant. Ellie grabbed her flashlight, clicked it on, and stepped through the opening into a space that had been sealed away from the world since before she was born. The beam of her light swept across an interior that was mostly empty, just as the rest of the car had been, with rotting wooden crates stacked haphazardly against one wall, their contents long since deteriorated into unrecognizable pulp, and puddles of water that had somehow seeped in despite the welded seal, creating pools of stagnant liquid on the metal floor. But Ranger ignored all of it, running straight to the far corner where the floor met the wall, and there he began to dig with renewed frenzy, his powerful paws scraping at the floorboards, his claws sending up small geysers of rust and ancient wood. And when Ellie directed her flashlight to that corner, she saw what had captured his attention. Several of the floorboards were different from the others, newer somehow despite their age, fitted together with a precision that suggested they had been deliberately placed to cover something. And as she knelt beside her dog in the darkness of that long-sealed cargo hold, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation, Ellie knew that whatever Catherine Harper had hidden here 30 years ago was about to be revealed. Ellie's hands trembled as she worked the crowbar beneath the edge of the first floorboard, the wood so rotted that it came up easily, despite 3 decades of settlement, crumbling at the edges as she lifted it and set it aside in the beam of her flashlight. Ranger had stopped digging now and sat back on his haunches, watching her work with an almost human patience, his job complete now that he had brought her to this exact spot, this precise corner of a sealed train car on a forgotten mountain siding. The second board came up just as easily, then the third, revealing a space beneath the floor that was surprisingly dry, protected from the moisture that had infiltrated the rest of the car by some quirk of construction, or perhaps by deliberate design. There, nestled in the hidden compartment, as if it had been placed there only yesterday, was a leather satchel, its surface darkened with age but otherwise remarkably intact, the brass buckles still gleaming dully in the flashlight's glow. Ellie lifted it out with careful hands, surprised by its weight, and carried it to the opening where the afternoon light still streamed in, suddenly needing to see this discovery in natural light rather than the artificial beam of her flashlight. She sat on the edge of the cargo hold doorway, her legs dangling over the side. Ranger pressed close against her, and with fingers that felt numb despite the work gloves she wore, she unbuckled the satchel and opened it. The contents spilled out into her lap like artifacts from another world, and the first thing she saw, the thing that made her breath catch in her throat, was a leather-bound journal with a name embossed in faded gold on the cover. Catherine Harper. The name hit her like a physical blow, not just because Martha had mentioned it, not just because it was the name of the woman who had disappeared, but because Harper was Ellie's surname, the name she had inherited from her father. And with shaking hands, she opened the journal to the first page where the same name was written again in careful script. Catherine Marie Harper, railway clerk, Rocky Mountain Rail Company, January 1962. Ellie's mind raced through fragmented family history, memories of her father mentioning his mother who had died before he was grown, a woman he barely remembered, a grandmother Ellie had never known because the family didn't talk about her, said it was too painful, said she had abandoned them. And now here was her name in a journal hidden in a train car on a mountain. Beside the journal were photographs, dozens of them, black and white images of people in 1960s clothing, railway workers posed beside trains, formal company events with men in suits and women in careful dresses, and one photograph in particular that made Ellie's hands shake, a young woman who looked startlingly like Ellie herself, and the same dark hair, the same determined set to her jaw, standing beside this very train car, her expression not happy, but frightened, haunted. There were official documents as well, pages of what looked like financial ledgers, internal company memos on letterhead that read, Rocky Mountain Rail Company, executive offices, transfer orders and payment receipts that meant nothing to Ellie yet, but were clearly important enough to hide. At the bottom of the satchel was a small velvet pouch, and when Ellie opened it with trembling fingers, an antique gold locket tumbled into her palm, its surface engraved with delicate flowers, and when she pressed the tiny catch it opened to reveal 2 photograph slots, one holding a picture of a young man in a soldier's uniform, the other holding a baby, and Ellie stared at that baby's face, at the date inscribed on the back of the locket, 1961, doing the mathematics in her head, realizing with a shock that sent ice through her veins that this baby was her father, that Catherine Harper was not just a disappeared woman, not just a name Martha had mentioned, but her own grandmother. And everything her family had told her about Catherine abandoning them, about her instability, about her simply vanishing, had been a lie, because a woman who hides evidence in a train car, who carefully preserves photographs and documents, and a locket containing her child's picture, is not a woman who abandons her family. She is a woman who is protecting them. And as Ellie sat in the doorway of the cargo hold with Ranger pressed against her side and her grandmother's life spread across her lap, she understood with terrible clarity that she had not bought an abandoned train car. She had inherited a legacy of silence and secrets, and the question that now burned in her mind was not what had Catherine Harper discovered, but what had she been killed to keep hidden? The light was fading fast, the mountain shadows lengthening across the clearing as Ellie climbed back into her truck, the satchel clutched protectively against her chest, Ranger settling into the passenger seat with a satisfied sigh as if his mission was finally complete. She turned on the dome light, the small bulb creating a warm circle of illumination in the growing darkness, and with hands that still trembled slightly from the magnitude of her discovery, she opened her grandmother's journal to the first page, the leather creaking softly after decades of silence. The entries began in January 1962, written in careful script, and Catherine's voice came through the pages with startling clarity, the voice of a young woman, only 23 years old, trying to navigate a professional world that didn't particularly want women doing anything more complicated than typing and filing. I started as a railway clerk today. The first entry read, Mr. Vincent Hale himself showed me to my desk. He's younger than I expected for someone who owns half the railway, perhaps 40, with silver hair and a smile that seems charming, until you notice it never quite reaches his eyes. He told me my job was simple. Keep the books organized, file the receipts, make sure everything balances, and never ask questions about things that don't concern me. The early entries were mundane, descriptions of daily work. The other clerks, Catherine struggles to manage her job while caring for her infant son, but by March the tone began to shift. "I've noticed something strange in the ledgers," Catherine wrote. "There are payments listed as federal railway subsidies, government money meant for track maintenance and safety improvements. But when I cross-reference them with the actual work orders, the amounts don't match, not by a little, but by thousands of dollars. And when I asked the senior accountant about the discrepancies, he told me very firmly that those accounts were handled directly by Mr. Hale's office and were none of my concern." Ellie read faster, watching her grandmother's growing alarm unfold. Catherine describing how she began making copies of documents when she stayed late, how she noticed that several company executives were living far beyond what their salaries should allow. By June, Catherine's entries had taken on a desperate quality. "I've been documenting everything," she wrote, "every falsified receipt, every diverted payment, every shell company that exists only on paper to funnel money into private accounts. The scope of it is staggering. Millions of dollars in federal funds, meant to keep the railway safe, are instead making Mr. Hale and his associates wealthy." The entries continued through the summer and fall, Catherine describing close calls, moments when she thought she had been discovered, the growing paranoia that she was being watched, and then in May 1963, the final entries that made Ellie's blood run cold. "He knows," Catherine wrote in a less careful hand, more hurried now. "Vincent Hale called me into his office today and asked me directly if I had been going through files that didn't concern me. I denied it, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. I've hidden everything in the train car. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, someone needs to find this evidence and finish what I started. These men have stolen from everyone in this valley, and they've done it with smiles on their faces. And I will not let my son grow up in a world where such evil goes unpunished." That was the last entry, dated May 15th, 1963, 3 days before Catherine Harper vanished. And Ellie sat in her truck as darkness fell completely over the mountain, the journal open in her lap, understanding now that her grandmother had not abandoned anyone. She had been murdered for threatening to expose a conspiracy. And the satchel Ellie now possessed was not just family history, but evidence of a crime. And somewhere out there, the descendants of the men who had killed Catherine Harper were still powerful, still protected, and still very interested in making sure this evidence stayed buried forever. Ellie made the decision to camp near the train car, rather than attempt the treacherous drive down the mountain in darkness, pulling her truck into a sheltered spot beneath a stand of pines, and setting up a simple camp with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent enough time in the wilderness to know the essentials. She built a small fire in a ring of stones, the flames pushing back the profound darkness of the mountain night, and sat with her back against a fallen log, the satchel beside her, and Ranger stretched out at her feet, his body warm and reassuring. The journal held her attention for hours, Catherine's words painting a picture of systematic corruption that had stolen millions from public funds, and Ellie read by firelight until her eyes burned and the words began to blur. It was just past midnight when Ranger's head shot up, his ears pricking forward, a low warning growl rumbling in his chest before Ellie heard anything at all. Then she caught it, the distant sound of an engine laboring up the mountain road, growing steadily louder, and a moment later headlights swept across the clearing, far too bright and official-looking to be a lost hiker. The vehicle that pulled up beside her truck was a sheriff's department SUV, its emergency lights dark, but its presence unmistakably authoritative. And the man who stepped out was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a sheriff's uniform and a carefully neutral expression. "Evening, miss," he called out, his voice carrying the practiced friendliness of someone used to being obeyed. I'm Sheriff Dalton. Got a call from town that someone had purchased the old train car property. Thought I'd drive up and make sure you were doing all right out here. It's pretty isolated, and we've had some trouble with vandals in the area." Ellie stood slowly, keeping the fire between them, acutely aware of the satchel at her feet, and the way Ranger had positioned himself slightly in front of her, his body tense and watchful. "I'm fine, Sheriff. Just camping on my own property," she replied, keeping her voice level and polite. Dalton stepped closer to the fire, his eyes scanning the camp with an intensity that felt like more than casual concern, lingering on her truck, the train car behind her, the small pile of gear she had laid out. "That's quite a purchase you made," he said, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp. "Most folks around here wouldn't touch that old wreck with a 10-foot pole. Too much history, too much trouble. What made you decide to buy it?" Ellie met his gaze steadily, her social worker training helping her recognize the technique, the seemingly casual questions designed to extract information, the friendly demeanor masking a more predatory interest. "Just looking for some peace and quiet, Sheriff. Seemed like a good investment for the price." Dalton's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the same detail Catherine had noted about Vincent Hale in her journal. And he took another step closer, near enough now that Ellie could see the way his hand rested casually near his sidearm. "You find anything interesting in there?" he asked, gesturing toward the train car. Any idea why it was sealed up all those years? The question was too specific, too pointed, and Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Just a lot of rust and rotted wood," she lied smoothly. "Nothing worth the effort of cutting through those welds." Dalton studied her for a long moment, and Ellie had the distinct impression he was deciding whether to believe her or to escalate this encounter into something more threatening. But then Ranger let out a sharp, aggressive bark, and the sheriff took a step back. "Well, if you're sure you're all right, I'll leave you to it," Dalton said, his tone still friendly, but his eyes cold. "Just remember, this is a long way from help if you run into any trouble, and sometimes it's better to leave old things buried. Saves everyone a lot of difficulty." He climbed back into his SUV and drove away, but Ellie noticed he didn't head straight back down the mountain road. Instead, his headlights swept in a wide circle around her camp before finally disappearing down the trail, and when she walked the perimeter in the morning light, she found fresh tire tracks that had circled her position multiple times during the night. The marks of someone who had come back after their official visit, someone who had been watching her camp from the darkness. And the message was clear as the mountain air. She was not alone on this mountain. She was being watched, and the people who had killed her grandmother 30 years ago knew exactly where she was. Sleep was impossible after Sheriff Dalton's visit. The image of those circling tire tracks burned into Ellie's mind, and she sat by the dying fire with the satchel open beside her, pulling out the stack of photographs she had only glanced at earlier in the fading light. Now, with her flashlight and the last glowing embers providing illumination, she examined each image, carefully arranging them in chronological order based on the dates stamped on the backs, watching her grandmother's story unfold in frozen moments of black and white. The earliest photographs showed Catherine as she must have looked when she first started at the railway company, young and hopeful, her dark hair styled in the fashion of the early 1960s, wearing a modest dress and standing with other clerks in front of the railway office building, their faces all turned toward the camera with the formal expressions people wore in that era. There were images of company events, Christmas parties where men in dark suits held cocktail glasses, and women in careful dresses smiled with varying degrees of genuine pleasure. And in several of these photographs, Ellie recognized the face of Vincent Hale, always positioned at the center of the group, always commanding attention, even in a still image, his silver hair and confident smile exactly as Catherine had described in her journal. One photograph made Ellie's breath catch. It showed a group of railway executives standing beside a passenger train, and among them was a younger man who looked startlingly familiar. She flipped the photo over and read the caption written in Catherine's hand, "Vincent Hale, with son Marcus and company vice presidents, 1962, and Ellie realized Marcus Hale would have been Richard Hale's father. The link between the man who had stolen millions and the powerful developer who now controlled half the county. But it was the final photograph in the stack that made Ellie's hands tremble, showing Catherine standing alone beside the train car, this exact train car that Ellie now owned, and unlike the other photographs where Catherine wore careful professional expressions, in this one, her face was pale and tight with fear, her eyes wide and haunted, looking not at the camera, but off to the side as if watching for someone. The photograph was slightly blurred, as if taken in haste, and the lighting suggested early morning or late evening, shadows stretching long across the ground. Ellie turned it over with shaking hands, and there in Catherine's familiar script was a message that felt like a communication across 3 decades. "The proof is here," the inscription read, May 15th, 1963. Ellie's mind raced, calculating dates, cross-referencing with the journal entries she had read. May 15th was the date of Catherine's last journal entry, the one where she had written that Vincent Hale knew she had been investigating him, the one where she said she had hidden everything in the train car, and this photograph was dated the same day, meaning Catherine had come to this mountain siding, had hidden the satchel beneath the floorboards, had taken this photograph as documentation, or perhaps as a final message, and then 3 days later, according to the family history Ellie's father had shared in the rare moments he spoke of his mother, Catherine Harper had vanished without a trace. The official story became that she had abandoned her family, left her infant son, walked away from her life, and now Ellie sat on the same mountain where her grandmother had stood in terror, holding a photograph that proved Catherine had not run away, but had been silenced, murdered, for threatening to expose the truth. And as the first grey light of dawn began to touch the peaks around her, and Ranger pressed close against her side, Ellie understood that she was no longer just investigating a historical mystery. She was holding evidence of murder, and the people responsible, or their descendants at least, were still powerful enough to send a sheriff to her camp in the middle of the night, still watching, still waiting, still willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. Ellie left the mountain at first light, the satchel hidden beneath the passenger seat of her truck, Ranger alert and watchful beside her, as they navigated the treacherous road back to town, her mind churning through everything she had learned, everything Catherine had documented, and the terrifying realization that powerful people were already aware of her presence on that mountain. The town's historical society was housed in a renovated Victorian building on Main Street, its painted sign creaking gently in the morning breeze, and when Ellie pushed through the heavy wooden door, a bell chimed softly, announcing her arrival to the single occupant, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. "I'm Grace," the woman said, looking up from a desk covered in archived documents. "Welcome to our little repository of local history. How can I help you this morning?" Ellie hesitated, wondering how much to reveal, then decided that half-truths would serve her better than complete honesty. "I'm researching my family history," she said carefully. "My grandmother lived here in the early 1960s, Catherine Harper, and I'm trying to find out more about her life here." Grace's expression shifted, something flickering behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or concern, and she stood slowly, gesturing for Ellie to follow her to a back room lined with filing cabinets and boxes of yellowed newspapers. "Catherine Harper," Grace repeated quietly. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. She disappeared in May of 1963. It was quite the scandal at the time. Let me pull the newspaper archives from that period." Ellie watched as Grace worked methodically through the filing system, pulling out bound volumes of the local newspaper, the Flathead County Chronicle, dating from April through June 1963, and spreading them carefully on a large wooden table. "Here," Grace said, pointing to a front-page article dated May 20th of 1963. This was the first report. The headline made Ellie's stomach clench. "Local woman missing. Railway clerk vanishes without trace." And beneath it was a photograph of Catherine, The same face Ellie had seen in the satchel, but reproduced in grainy newsprint, her grandmother's eyes, staring out from the past, with an expression the photographer had captured as serious and determined. The article described how Catherine Harper, age 24, a clerk at the Rocky Mountain Rail Company, had failed to report to work on May 18, how her infant son had been found alone in her apartment, crying but unharmed, how there were no signs of struggle or forced entry, and how she had simply vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Ellie read through the subsequent articles, watching the story evolve over the following weeks, and with each new piece, the narrative shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. By the second article, Catherine was described as having been under significant stress at work. By the third, she was characterized as emotionally unstable. And by the fourth, published 2 weeks after her disappearance. The implication was clear that she had abandoned her child, possibly suffered a mental breakdown, and left town of her own accord. The final article Ellie found, dated June 15, 1963, announced that the investigation was being scaled back due to lack of evidence of foul play, and quoted Sheriff Thomas Brennan, presumably Dalton's predecessor, as saying that while they hoped Miss Harper would be found safe, all indications suggested she had chosen to leave her previous life behind. Ellie's hands clenched into fists as she read the carefully constructed lie, the systematic destruction of her grandmother's reputation, turning a murder victim into an unstable woman who had abandoned her responsibilities. And she thought of the journal entries she had read, Catherine's clear, methodical documentation, her rational analysis of financial crimes, her careful planning to protect both the evidence and her son. This was not a troubled woman. This was a woman who had been silenced, and the newspaper articles were part of that silencing, shaping public perception, so that when she disappeared, people would believe she had simply walked away rather than been killed. Grace watched Ellie's face as she read, and finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You found something, didn't you? Something that changes the story they told us." And Ellie looked up at the librarian, seeing in her eyes not suspicion, but hope. The hope of someone who had lived with an official lie for decades and desperately wanted to know the truth. And in that moment, Ellie made a decision that would define everything that followed. "Yes," she said quietly, "I found the truth, and it's nothing like what they told you." Ellie spread the documents across the table in her motel room that evening, the door locked and the curtains drawn, Ranger lying watchfully by the door as she organized Catherine's evidence into a coherent picture of corporate theft on a scale that took her breath away. The papers were yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, their official letterheads and stamped seals lending them an authenticity that would be impossible to dispute. And, as Ellie worked through them systematically, her social worker training helping her recognize patterns and connections, the full scope of Vincent Hale's embezzlement scheme revealed itself like a grotesque work of art. The earliest documents were internal railway company memos dated from 1959, discussing the receipt of federal subsidies allocated under the National Railway Safety and Modernization Act, funds specifically designated for track maintenance, signal system upgrades, and safety equipment installation, with amounts listed in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per quarter. These were followed by procurement orders and contractor agreements that appeared legitimate on their surface, authorizing work on various railway infrastructure projects throughout the region, each document carefully filed and properly initialed by company executives. But Catherine had included additional papers that told a different story, duplicate invoices showing that the actual amounts paid to contractors were a fraction of what the federal subsidy documents claimed, with the difference vanishing into a maze of shell companies and phantom accounts. Ellie found transfer orders moving money from the Rocky Mountain Rail Company accounts to entities with innocuous names like Western Development Partners and Mountain Infrastructure Holdings, each transfer initialed VH in distinctive script, Vincent Hale's personal authorization for the theft of public funds. The financial ledgers were the most damning, showing parallel accounting systems, one set of books that would pass federal audits and showed funds being properly allocated to safety improvements, and another set, the real books, that tracked the actual flow of money into private accounts controlled by Hale, and at least 4 other company executives whose initials appeared repeatedly on the transfer documents. Catherine had helpfully annotated many of the pages in pencil, drawing arrows to connect related transactions, calculating the total amounts diverted, and in one margin she had written a figure that made Ellie's hands shake. Total estimated theft, 1959 to 1963, approximately $8.7 million, a sum that would be equivalent to perhaps 70 or 80 million in today's economy. Every single document bore Vincent Hale's initials or signature, an arrogant trail of evidence that suggested he had never imagined anyone would dare to challenge him, never conceived that a young railway clerk would have the courage and determination to piece together his crimes from the fragments of paper that crossed her desk. Ellie photographed each document with her phone, creating digital backups, then carefully returned them to the satchel, her mind already working through the implications. This was not just evidence of historical crimes. This was the foundation of the Hale family fortune, the source of their power and influence. And if Richard Hale's wealth and political connections were built on money stolen from taxpayers 60 years ago, then exposing this truth would not just rewrite history. It would destroy one of the most powerful families in Montana, and they would do anything, absolutely anything, to prevent that from happening. Ellie returned to the Historical Society the next morning, finding Grace already at her desk, and the older woman's face showed she had been expecting this visit, perhaps had been waiting for someone to come asking the right questions for 30 years. "Come to the back," Grace said quietly, glancing toward the front windows, as if worried about who might see them talking. "There are things you need to understand about the Hale family before you go any further with whatever you've found." They sat in the archive room, surrounded by the documented history of the county, and Grace spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Vincent Hale died in 1985. Heart attack. Very sudden, very convenient timing, given that there had been some federal auditors starting to ask questions about old railway subsidy discrepancies, but his son Marcus had already taken over most of the business interests by then, transforming the railway money into real estate developments, shopping centres, housing subdivisions, all built on that initial capital that your grandmother tried to expose. Marcus passed away 15 years ago, and now it's Richard Hale, Vincent's grandson, who controls what has become a business empire worth hundreds of millions. He owns the largest development company in 3 counties, sits on the boards of 2 banks, has connections to the state legislature and probably the governor's office. There's hardly a major construction project or land deal in this region that doesn't involve the Hale family in some way. Grace pulled out a folder she had clearly prepared, filled with newspaper clippings about Richard Hale, photographs of him at charity galas and political fundraisers, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by other powerful people, his silver hair and confident smile an eerie echo of his grandfather's appearance in Catherine's old photographs. "The family presents themselves as pillars of the community," Grace continued. "Philanthropists, job creators, civic leaders. But there's another pattern if you know where to look." She showed Ellie a series of articles spanning decades, seemingly unrelated stories about people who had opposed Hale family interests. A county inspector who had questioned building permits and then died in a single car accident on a straight road. An environmental activist who had protested one of their developments and subsequently moved out of state after her house was burglarized 3 times in 2 months. A journalist who had started investigating Hale family finances and whose career was destroyed by allegations of plagiarism that were never quite proven, but never quite disproven. "People who cross the Hales," Grace whispered, leaning close. "They tend to have unfortunate accidents, or they suddenly decide it's time to leave town, or they find their reputations destroyed, their livelihoods threatened, and the official authorities, well, let's just say that Sheriff Dalton's family has been on the Hale payroll in one form or another for 3 generations. Ellie felt the weight of this information settling over her like a shroud, understanding now that she was not just investigating a historical crime, but threatening a living empire built on that crime, and the people who benefited from her grandmother's murder were still in power, still dangerous, and now they knew exactly who she was and what she had found. Ellie left the Historical Society, with Grace's warnings echoing in her mind, the folder of newspaper clippings tucked under her arm, and walked back to where she had parked her truck on a side street near the town square, Ranger trotting beside her with his usual calm alertness. She was still 20 feet away when she noticed it, a small white rectangle tucked under the windshield wiper, fluttering slightly in the mountain breeze, and her stomach clenched with instant recognition that this was not a parking citation or an advertisement, but something far more sinister. The note was handwritten on plain white paper, the letters printed in anonymous block capitals that could belong to anyone, and the message was brief and unmistakably threatening. "Some stories are better left buried," it read. "Leave now while you still can." Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she held the paper, looking around the quiet street, seeing the usual small-town afternoon activity, people going about their business, cars passing by, everything normal on the surface. But someone had been here, had watched her enter the Historical Society, had taken the time to write this warning and place it on her vehicle, close enough to touch her property, close enough to send a very clear message. Ranger suddenly went rigid, his attention focused on the alley between two buildings across the street, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his hackles rising along his spine, and Ellie followed his gaze but saw nothing, just shadows and the usual clutter of trash bins and utility boxes, yet she trusted her dog's senses completely, knowing that if Ranger detected a threat, there was a threat whether she could see it or not. She climbed into her truck quickly, locking the doors, and drove straight back to the mountain, to the train car, to the only place that felt even remotely safe despite its isolation. That night, she built her fire larger than usual, the flames pushing back the darkness, and sat with her back against a boulder, the satchel beside her and Ranger lying close, his body a warm barrier between her and the surrounding forest. Around midnight she heard them, the soft, careful footsteps of someone, or more than one someone, moving through the woods just beyond the circle of firelight, the deliberate crunch of boots on pine, needles, stopping and starting, circling her position like predators assessing their prey. Ranger was on his feet instantly, his body between Ellie and the sounds, his growl now a continuous threatening rumble that echoed across the clearing, and the footsteps stopped, retreated slightly, but did not leave completely. Ellie sat awake through the entire night, her hand on Ranger's tense shoulders, listening to the invisible watchers in the darkness, understanding with absolute clarity that she was no longer simply investigating her grandmother's disappearance. She was being actively hunted by people who had successfully kept their secrets buried for 30 years, and who would not hesitate to bury her alongside Catherine if she gave them the opportunity. Ellie spent the grey morning after her sleepless night, examining every item from the satchel with renewed intensity, knowing now that her grandmother had been methodical and careful, understanding that Catherine would have considered every possibility, every contingency, including the very real chance that her evidence might be discovered and destroyed by the people she was investigating. The antique locket had seemed purely sentimental at first, a keepsake containing photographs of her husband and infant son, but as Ellie turned it over in her hands, studying the intricate engraving of flowers on its gold surface, she noticed something that sent a jolt of excitement through her exhausted body. The locket was heavier than it should be, subtly but noticeably heavier, as if there were more to its interior than just the 2 photograph frames visible when it opened. She examined the hinge mechanism closely, running her fingernail along the edge of the inner casing, and felt a tiny irregularity, a seam so fine it was almost invisible, disguised by the decorative scrollwork that lined the interior. With careful pressure applied to a specific point on the inner frame, she heard a soft click, and a hidden compartment behind the photograph slots sprang open, revealing a space no bigger than her thumbnail, but perfectly designed to conceal something small and vital. Inside the secret compartment lay 2 objects that made Ellie's breath catch: a tiny brass key, tarnished with age but still intact, no bigger than her pinky finger, and a fragment of paper that had been folded multiple times to fit into the minuscule space. She unfolded the paper with trembling hands, careful not to tear the fragile material, and found a sequence of numbers written in Catherine's precise handwriting, followed by words that changed everything. Safety Deposit Box 847, First National Bank of Helena, the note read, and beneath it a single additional line. If the train car fails, this is the proof. Helena was the state capital, over 200 miles away, and First National Bank was one of the oldest financial institutions in Montana, the kind of conservative establishment that would maintain safety deposit boxes for decades, that would honor the rights of legal heirs even after the original box holder had been dead for 30 years. Catherine had created a backup plan, Ellie realized with growing amazement, understanding her grandmother's brilliance, her foresight, her determination to ensure that even if the evidence hidden in the train car was discovered and destroyed, even if she herself was silenced, there would still be proof, still a way for the truth to emerge. The locket had been kept with the satchel rather than worn or carried, suggesting Catherine had hidden it deliberately as part of her insurance policy, knowing that whoever found the train car evidence would also find the key to the safety deposit box, creating a chain of discovery that would lead from the mountain to the capital city, from the past to a future where justice might finally be possible. Ellie returned to Martha's place the following afternoon, exhaustion making her movements slow, but hunger finally overriding her paranoia, and she slid into the same corner booth she had occupied days earlier. Ranger settling at her feet with a tired sigh that mirrored her own weariness. The diner was quieter than before, just a handful of customers, and Martha brought coffee without being asked, setting down the pot with a meaningful look before retreating to give Ellie privacy. She was halfway through her sandwich when a man approached her table, perhaps in his early 40s, with an intelligent face, wire-rimmed glasses, and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent more time thinking than worrying about his clothes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who knows he might be intruding. "I'm Daniel Cross. I run the Flathead County Independent. It's a small weekly newspaper, mostly local news and classifieds, and I couldn't help but notice you've been asking questions about Catherine Harper." Ellie's hand moved instinctively closer to the satchel on the seat beside her, her body tensing, but something in Daniel's expression, a combination of genuine curiosity and what looked like barely suppressed excitement, made her pause rather than send him away. "Martha mentioned you were researching family history," Daniel continued, sliding into the booth across from her without waiting for an invitation. "And I want you to know that Catherine Harper's disappearance has been an obsession of mine for almost 5 years now, ever since I moved here from Seattle after burning out on investigative journalism, and thought I'd found a quiet place to run a small-town paper." He laughed, a self-deprecating sound. "Turns out you can't take the investigator out of the journalist, and this town has a story buried so deep that everyone pretends it doesn't exist." Daniel glanced around the diner, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've been researching the Hale family, tracing their finances back through public records, corporate filings, property transfers, building a timeline of how Vincent Hale went from a moderately successful railway executive to one of the wealthiest men in Montana in just a few years. And the numbers don't add up. They've never added up, but I've never had proof, never had anything concrete enough to publish without getting sued into oblivion or worse." Ellie studied him carefully, her social worker instincts reading his body language, his earnest expression, the way his hands trembled slightly, with what she recognized as the excitement of a journalist who senses a breaking story, and she made a decision that was either brilliant or catastrophically foolish. "What if I told you I have proof?" she said quietly. "What if I told you I have documentation of every dollar Vincent Hale stole, every account he falsified, every crime he committed, all of it initialed by him personally?" Daniel's eyes widened behind his glasses, and for a long moment he simply stared at her, Then he whispered, "I'd say that's the most dangerous thing anyone in this town has possessed in 30 years. And I'd ask when we can start working on the story that's going to bring the Hale family empire down." Ellie and Daniel drove up the mountain together the next morning, his compact sedan struggling with the rough terrain, while her truck would have handled easily. But she appreciated having another person with her, someone who understood the stakes and seemed genuinely committed to exposing the truth rather than burying it deeper. They rounded the final bend into the clearing, and Ellie's stomach dropped as she saw immediately that something was wrong. The train car's cargo hold door that she had carefully closed after her initial discovery now hung open, twisted on its ancient rollers, and debris was scattered across the ground in a pattern that spoke of violent, destructive searching. She was out of the car before Daniel had fully stopped, Ranger bounding ahead of her, and when she reached the cargo hold entrance, the full extent of the violation became clear in the harsh morning light. The interior had been systematically destroyed, every wooden crate smashed open, and their rotted contents strewn across the floor. The floorboards she had carefully pried up to find the satchel now completely torn out, leaving gaping holes in the cargo hold floor like missing teeth, and the walls had been struck repeatedly with something heavy, denting the metal, as if someone had been searching for additional hidden compartments or simply venting their fury at not finding what they sought. Daniel stood beside her, his face pale, taking photographs with his phone, documenting the destruction. They were looking for the evidence, he said unnecessarily, and when they didn't find it, they made sure there wouldn't be anything left for anyone else to discover. Ellie knelt at the edge of the cargo hold, examining the muddy ground, and there they were, boot prints, multiple sets, at least 3 different people based on the varying sizes and tread patterns, and the prints were fresh, made within the last day, probably within the last few hours, given how clearly defined they remained in the soft earth. The tracks led away from the train car into the dense forest to the north, disappearing into the undergrowth, and Ranger followed them for a few yards, sniffing intently, before returning to Ellie's side with a low growl. "They know," Ellie said quietly, her hands clenched into fists. "They know I found something. They know I have Catherine's evidence, and they're desperate enough to come up here and tear apart a train car, looking for anything I might have missed." The message could not have been clearer if they had spray-painted it across the rusted metal. She was being watched, her movements tracked, and the people who had killed her grandmother were getting increasingly desperate, which made them increasingly dangerous. And the only question now was whether Ellie could get the evidence to the right authorities before they decided that ransacking an abandoned train car wasn't enough, before they escalated from property destruction to something far more permanent. The journey to Helena took 4 hours, Ellie driving her truck with Daniel following in his sedan. Ranger stretched across the back seat with his head resting on the satchel, as if guarding it even in sleep. And they arrived at the state capitol just before noon, the First National Bank standing as it had for over a century, a granite fortress on the corner of Main and Fifth, its architecture speaking of an era when banks were designed to convey permanence and trustworthiness. Inside, the lobby was cool and hushed, all marble floors and dark wood paneling, and the manager who eventually emerged from his office was a thin man in his 60s named Mr. Warren, whose skeptical expression suggested he dealt with treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists on a regular basis and had little patience for either. "My grandmother, Catherine Harper, maintained a safety deposit box here," Ellie explained, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "She died in 1963. And I believe I'm the legal heir with the right to access it." Mr. Warren's eyebrows rose slightly. "Miss, we have protocols for accessing boxes belonging to deceased account holders. You'll need to provide proof of death, documentation of your relationship, legal authorization from probate court. This process typically takes months, and quite frankly, most boxes that old have been closed out or transferred." Ellie placed the tiny brass key on his desk with a soft click, then carefully laid out Catherine's driver's license from the satchel, her own identification showing the Harper surname, and her father's birth certificate proving the direct family connection. "Box 847, she said quietly. Mr. Warren's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise as he picked up the key, examining it closely, then excused himself to check the bank's records, returning 20 minutes later with a different demeanor. Entirely professional curiosity replacing dismissive doubt. "The box is still active," he said, sounding genuinely amazed. "The rental was prepaid for 99 years in 1963, which was highly unusual but not unheard of at the time. And given the documentation you've provided, I believe we can grant access under the legal heir provisions." He led them down to the vault, a massive steel door that required 2 keys to open. And inside the climate-controlled room, rows of brass-fronted boxes lined the walls, each one a small fortress of secrets. Mr. Warren located box 847, inserted both his master key and Catherine's key, and pulled out a long metal container, setting it on the table in the private viewing room, before discreetly withdrawing. Ellie's hands shook as she lifted the lid, and inside was Catherine's final insurance policy, more documents, duplicate copies of the most damning financial records, but also something new, a thick notarized statement dated May 14th, 1963, just 1 day before Catherine's final journal entry, typed on legal paper and signed by her and witnessed by a notary public whose embossed seal was still visible after 6 decades. The statement was comprehensive and devastating, naming Vincent Hale and 4 other executives by name, detailing the exact mechanism of their embezzlement scheme, listing specific account numbers and shell companies, and concluding with Catherine's sworn testimony that she feared for her life, that she had been threatened, and that if anything should happen to her, this document should be considered evidence of conspiracy and murder. They were still in the bank parking lot, Ellie carefully placing the metal box containing Catherine's notarized statement in the truck beside the satchel, when her phone rang, the number showing as unknown, and she answered it with a sense of foreboding that proved immediately justified. "Miss Harper," a smooth, cultured voice, said, "This is Richard Hale. I believe it's time we had a conversation about your recent purchase and your activities over the past week." Ellie's blood ran cold, her eyes meeting Daniel's across the truck bed, and she put the phone on speaker so he could hear. "Mr. Hale," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I'm surprised you'd call me directly." Richard Hale's laugh was pleasant, the kind of laugh that belonged to boardrooms and charity galas. "I'm a businessman, Miss Harper, and I prefer direct communication when possible. It saves time and prevents misunderstandings. So let me be very clear. I'm prepared to offer you $200,000 for the train car property, and any items you may have found there. It's a generous offer, more than generous considering you paid $500 just days ago, and I think you'll agree it's the smart choice for everyone involved." The emphasis on smart choice carried an unmistakable undercurrent of threat, and Ellie felt her anger rising to match her fear. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Hale. The property has sentimental value." The pleasant tone vanished from Hale's voice, replaced by something colder, harder, more honest. "Miss Harper, I don't think you understand the situation you've put yourself in. My family has deep roots in this community. We have friends in law enforcement, in the courts, in places that matter. And you're a newcomer, an outsider, playing with things you don't understand, things that are frankly none of your business." Ellie's grip tightened on the phone. "My grandmother's murder is very much my business." There was a long pause, and when Hale spoke again, his voice was ice. "Your grandmother was an unstable woman who abandoned her family. That's the historical record. That's what everyone who matters believes. And I'd hate to see you suffer a similar unfortunate fate. Accidents happen in the mountains, Miss Harper. People disappear. It would be tragic if something happened to you, especially after you've already lost so much family." The threat was explicit now, no longer veiled in polite language, and Ellie realized with crystalline clarity that Richard Hale was not just protecting his family's reputation. He was fighting for his empire's survival, and he had just revealed that he knew exactly what had happened to Catherine, which made him not just a beneficiary of murder, but potentially complicit in its cover-up. She ended the call without responding, her hands shaking, and looked at Daniel, whose face had gone pale. "He just threatened to kill you," Daniel whispered. "We need to go to the police, the FBI, someone." Ellie shook her head, thinking of Sheriff Dalton's midnight visit, Grace's warnings about the Hale family's reach. "We go public," she said. "We publish everything. Make it impossible for them to silence us without everyone knowing why." They drove to Daniel's newspaper office, a cramped space above a hardware store that smelled of old paper and printer ink, and spread everything across his desk: Catherine's journal, the notarized statement, the financial documents, the newspaper articles about her disappearance, and Daniel's own years of research into the Hale family, creating a timeline that stretched across his entire wall, connecting dates and events with pieces of string like a detective's murder board. The full story emerged slowly, pieced together from fragments of evidence and careful deduction. A tragedy that had played out on a Montana mountain 60 years ago and had shaped the course of Ellie's entire family history. According to the notarized statement Catherine had left in the safety deposit box, she had made a fatal decision on May 16th, 1963, the day after her final journal entry, driven by a sense of moral obligation that would cost her everything. She had requested a meeting with Vincent Hale, presenting him with a summary of her findings, not all the evidence, but enough to make clear that she knew about the embezzlement, that she had documentation, and that she was prepared to take it to federal authorities unless the stolen money was returned and the responsible parties held accountable. Catherine had believed, perhaps naively, that confronting Hale directly would give him a chance to make things right, to avoid prosecution by cooperating. But she had fundamentally misunderstood the kind of man she was dealing with, someone for whom wealth and power were worth any price, including murder. Daniel had found a small article in the May 17th edition of the newspaper, buried on page 6, mentioning that Vincent Hale had been seen leaving town on May 16th for a business trip to inspect railway properties in the mountains, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Hale must have followed Catherine when she drove to the train car to check on her hidden evidence, perhaps bringing men with him, trusted associates who would help him handle the problem this troublesome clerk had become. The statement Catherine had notarized the day before her confrontation with Hale included a chilling line that now read like prophecy. "If I am found dead, or if I disappear, Vincent Hale is responsible. He has already made veiled threats about what happens to people who cause problems for his company, and I believe he is capable of violence to protect his secrets. What happened on that mountain was something Ellie and Daniel could only reconstruct from the evidence of absence, the struggle that must have occurred when Catherine realized, too late, that Hale had not come to negotiate, but to eliminate the threat she represented. Catherine's body was never found, which suggested premeditation. Hale and his accomplices had come prepared to dispose of evidence, and the vast wilderness surrounding the train car offered countless places where a body could be hidden, ravines and abandoned mine shafts and dense forests where searchers would never think to look. The official investigation had been perfunctory at best. Sheriff Brennan, Dalton's predecessor, and likely another Hale family asset, had accepted the narrative of an unstable woman abandoning her child, had never seriously considered the train car as a crime scene, had never questioned why a loving mother would leave her infant son alone in an apartment. Catherine's family, Ellie's grandfather and her infant father, had been told she had simply left, disappeared, chosen to abandon her responsibilities, and that lie had poisoned everything that came after. Her grandfather dying young, reportedly from a broken heart, her father growing up believing his mother hadn't loved him enough to stay, the shame and confusion passing down through generations until it reached Ellie herself, who had grown up knowing almost nothing about the grandmother whose name she shared. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, Ellie thought as she stared at the wall of evidence. Vincent Hale had not just murdered Catherine. He had murdered her reputation, her memory, her place in her own family's history, turning her from a hero who had died, fighting corruption into a villain who had abandoned her child, and that lie had been maintained for 60 years by power money, and the systematic suppression of anyone who came close to the truth. And now, Ellie stood in a cramped newspaper office with a journalist who ran a weekly paper that barely broke even, facing a family whose wealth and influence seemed insurmountable, and the only weapons they had were the truth and Catherine's fierce, undying determination that justice would eventually prevail. And Ellie touched the locket hanging around her neck now, feeling the weight of the small key hidden inside, and swore to her grandmother that this time, finally, the truth would not be buried. The call came the following morning, Sheriff Dalton's voice crackling through Ellie's phone with forced friendliness that immediately set off alarm bells in her mind. "Miss Harper, I've been doing some digging into your grandmother's case, going through old files in the basement. And I found something I think you should see. Why don't we meet at the train car this afternoon, say around 3 o'clock, and I'll show you what I discovered." Ellie looked at Daniel across the newspaper office, her finger hovering over the speaker button, and his expression was grim as he shook his head emphatically, mouthing the word, "trap." "It's a trap," Daniel said aloud after she ended the call. Dalton's had 60 years to look through those files. He suddenly finds something. The day after Richard Hale threatens you. It's not a coincidence. They're trying to get you isolated. Ellie knew he was right, but she also knew they couldn't hide forever, couldn't simply wait for the Hale family to make their next move. "We go," she said quietly, "but we go prepared, and we make sure someone knows where we are and what we're doing." Daniel made copies of everything, sending digital files to 3 different journalists he trusted at larger newspapers, writing a detailed email explaining the entire situation and scheduling it to send automatically if he didn't cancel it by 6 o'clock, creating a dead man's switch that would ensure the story survived, even if they didn't. They drove to the train car separately, arriving early, and Ellie positioned her truck where it had a clear path to escape, while Daniel concealed his car in the trees with a view of the clearing, his phone ready to record everything. Ranger sensed the tension, staying close to Ellie's leg, his body alert and ready, his eyes scanning the forest with intense focus. Sheriff Dalton arrived exactly at 3 o'clock, but he didn't come alone. His SUV pulled into the clearing, followed by a black pickup truck, and 2 men stepped out, both wearing civilian clothes but carrying themselves with the rigid posture of military or security contractors, and both openly armed with holstered pistols. Dalton walked forward with his hands visible and empty, his face arranged in an expression of false concern. "Miss Harper, I'm glad you came. I really do have information that I think will help you understand what happened to your grandmother." Ellie stood her ground, Ranger positioned between her and the approaching men, and she kept her voice steady. "What information would that be, Sheriff?" Dalton's friendly mask slipped, and his face hardened into something uglier, more honest. The information that you need to stop digging into things that don't concern you, that you need to hand over everything you found in that train car, every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper, and then you need to leave this county and forget you ever heard the name Catherine Harper. The 2 armed men had fanned out, moving to flank Ellie's position, and she realized they had done this before, had positioned themselves with the practiced efficiency of people who knew how to intimidate and control. "I've been on the Hale family payroll for 15 years, Dalton continued, his voice almost conversational now that the pretense was dropped. "Just like my father was before me. Just like Sheriff Brennan was before him. It's a good arrangement, very profitable, and the only thing required is that we make sure certain stories stay buried, certain evidence never sees the light of day, certain troublesome people understand the consequences of causing problems." Ranger's growl started low and deep, vibrating through the clearing, and the dog's hackles rose along his spine, his lips pulling back to reveal white teeth, his body coiled and ready to attack. The 2 armed men shifted nervously, their hands moving toward their weapons, and Dalton raised a hand to stop them. "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way, Miss Harper. The easy way is you give me everything you found. You sign a document, saying the train car property is being sold to the Hale Development Corporation for a very generous sum, and you drive out of here and never come back. The hard way is you disappear, just like your grandmother did. And believe me, we've had 60 years to get very good at making people disappear in these mountains. Ellie's hand moved to her pocket where she had placed her phone, already recording, and she looked at Dalton with a calm she didn't feel. Behind him, she could see Daniel emerging from the trees with his own phone raised, documenting everything. And she knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes, the truth was already beyond their ability to suppress, already uploaded to the cloud, already scheduled to reach people who couldn't be bought or threatened, and she smiled coldly at the sheriff. "The hard way it is, then," she said, "because I'm not my grandmother. I'm not alone, and I'm not going to disappear." The moment hung suspended, tension coiling tighter, and then Dalton nodded to his men, and everything exploded into violent motion. The two armed men moved forward simultaneously, their hands reaching for their weapons, and Ranger didn't wait for a command, his instincts and training taking over, and he launched himself at the nearest man with a speed and ferocity that transformed him from loyal companion into 100 pounds of protective fury. The attack was precise and devastating, Ranger's jaws clamping onto the man's forearm, just as his hand closed on his pistol, the sound of tearing fabric and a scream of pain echoing across the clearing, and the weapon clattered to the ground as the man stumbled backward, desperately trying to shake off the snarling dog. The second man swung his pistol toward Ranger, but Ellie was already moving, shouting "Run" to Daniel as she sprinted towards the tree line, and the distraction of Ranger's attack gave them the precious seconds they needed. A gunshot cracked through the air, deafeningly loud, the bullet thudding into a tree trunk inches from Ellie's head. And then she was in the forest, branches whipping at her face as she ran, hearing Daniel crashing through the undergrowth behind her, and Dalton's furious voice shouting orders. Another gunshot, then another, the sounds echoing weirdly through the dense pines, and Ellie's heart seized with terror that Ranger had been hit. But then she heard him, a triumphant bark followed by the sound of pursuit, paws pounding on the forest floor, and the grey and white shape of her dog burst through the trees and fell into stride beside her, unharmed, his tongue lolling, but his eyes bright with the fierce joy of protecting his pack. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably 15 minutes, following a deer trail that wound deeper into the wilderness, until finally Daniel gasped that he couldn't continue, and they collapsed behind a massive fallen log, their breath coming in ragged gasps, listening intently for sounds of pursuit. Ranger stood guard, his body still tense, his ears swiveling to catch every sound, and gradually the forest settled back into its normal rhythms, birds resuming their calls, the wind sighing through the high branches. They had escaped, but barely, and as Ellie looked at Daniel's pale, frightened face, and felt the adrenaline slowly draining from her system, she understood with absolute clarity that this was no longer about historical injustice or family history. This had become a matter of immediate survival. Dalton and his men had been willing to shoot at them in broad daylight, had crossed a line from intimidation into attempted murder, and the Hale family's desperation meant they would stop at nothing to prevent Catherine's evidence from seeing the light of day, which meant Ellie and Daniel had only one choice left. They had to go public immediately, had to get the story out before their enemies had another chance to silence them permanently. They made it back to Daniel's office by back roads, avoiding the main routes where Dalton might have set up roadblocks, and the moment they were inside with the door locked, Daniel went into action with the focused intensity of a journalist who had been waiting his entire career for this moment. He opened his laptop, pulled up the layout for the next edition of the Flathead County Independent, and began writing the story that would either save their lives or seal their fates, his fingers flying across the keyboard, while Ellie organized the evidence, scanning documents, uploading photographs, creating a digital archive of everything Catherine had preserved for 60 years. The headline wrote itself: "Murder, Corruption, and a 60-year cover-up. How the Hale family built an empire on stolen money, and a young mother's death." And beneath it, Daniel laid out the entire story in clear, devastating prose. Catherine's discovery of the embezzlement, her meticulous documentation, her confrontation with Vincent Hale, her murder and the subsequent cover-up that had protected 3 generations of criminals. He embedded images of the original documents, Catherine's handwritten journal entries, the notarized statement from the safety deposit box, the financial ledgers showing millions of dollars diverted from federal railway subsidies, and the photograph of Catherine standing, terrified beside the train car 3 days before she disappeared. But Daniel didn't stop with his own small newspaper. He sent the complete story and all supporting evidence simultaneously to the Montana Attorney General's office, the FBI field office in Helena, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Montana, and every major news organization he could think of, the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, creating redundancy that made it impossible for the story to be suppressed. By 6 o'clock that evening, the Flathead County Independence website, which normally received maybe 50 visitors a day, had crashed from the traffic, and Daniel's email was flooding with messages from journalists, producers, and investigators, all wanting confirmation, all wanting interviews, all sensing the magnitude of the story. By 8 o'clock, the first television news van arrived in town, parking outside the newspaper office, and by 10 o'clock, there were 5 more. Satellite dishes extending toward the sky, reporters doing stand-ups in front of Martha's Place and the county courthouse, and the story was trending on social media, and the hashtag Justice for Catherine spreading across platforms as people shared the shocking documentation of corruption and murder. The small Montana town that had kept its secrets for 60 years suddenly found itself under the harsh glare of national attention, and there was nowhere left for the Hale family to hide, no way to suppress the truth now that it had escaped into the world, multiplying and spreading faster than any threat or bribe could contain it. And Ellie sat in Daniel's office, watching the news coverage, with tears streaming down her face, knowing that her grandmother had finally, after 6 decades of silence, been heard. The FBI arrived before dawn, not the single agent that small towns usually see, but a full tactical team in black, SUVs, coordinated by the U.S. Attorney's Office and accompanied by agents from the Financial Crimes Division, who had spent the night reviewing Catherine's documentation and recognizing it as one of the most comprehensive cases of long-term fraud and corruption they had ever encountered. Sheriff Dalton was arrested at his home at 6 in the morning, agents swarming his property, with a warrant that listed conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other charges related to his decades of protecting the Hale family's interests, and the television cameras captured him being led out in handcuffs, his face no longer showing the arrogant confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, but the stunned disbelief of someone watching his world collapse. Richard Hale's arrest came 2 hours later, a more dramatic affair as agents descended on the Hale Development Corporation headquarters, a gleaming glass building on the outskirts of town that had been built with money that ultimately traced back to his grandfather's theft, and Richard was taken into custody in his executive office, surrounded by lawyers who were already making calls to every politician and judge they knew, not yet understanding that the scope of evidence made this case politically impossible to suppress. By noon, 6 county officials had been arrested, including 2 current county commissioners, the building inspector, and the county attorney, all charged with various counts of corruption and conspiracy. The web of complicity that had protected the Hale family for generations unraveling as each arrest led to more evidence, more connections, more crimes. The news coverage was relentless, every major network running the story, legal analysts explaining how the embezzlement scheme had worked, historians providing context about federal railway subsidies in the 1960s, and Catherine's photograph appearing again and again of the young woman who had died trying to expose corruption, now finally recognized as a hero, rather than the unstable abandoner her killers had painted her to be. Ellie watched it all from a hotel room in Helena, where the FBI had moved her for protection, Ranger lying at her feet, and she felt a complex mixture of emotions, grief for the grandmother she had never known, rage at the decades of injustice, and a profound sense of completion as she saw federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of Hale properties, forensic accountants tracing money through shell companies that had hidden stolen funds for 60 years, and prosecutors building cases that would ensure the Hale family's empire, built on theft and murder, would finally face the justice that Catherine had died trying to bring about. 3 months after the arrests, on a clear autumn day when the aspens had turned gold and the mountain air was crisp and clean, Ellie stood beside the train car and watched as people gathered for a ceremony that was 60 years overdue. The FBI had finished their investigation of the site, had carefully excavated the surrounding area in a futile search for Catherine's remains that yielded nothing, the wilderness having kept that final secret. And now the train car had been officially released back to Ellie, no longer evidence in a crime, but a memorial to courage and sacrifice. The crowd was larger than she had expected, perhaps 50 people making the difficult journey up the mountain road, and among them were faces Ellie had never seen. Family members who had come forward after the story broke, cousins and second cousins who shared the Harper name, and had their own fragmented memories of Catherine, stories that had been suppressed or dismissed for decades, but could finally be told. An elderly man introduced himself as Catherine's younger brother, Ellie's great-uncle Thomas, who had been only 15 when his sister disappeared, and had spent his entire life believing the lie that she had abandoned her family. And he wept openly as he told Ellie about Catherine's kindness, her fierce sense of right and wrong, the way she had always stood up for people who couldn't defend themselves. Daniel had written a beautiful piece for the memorial program, summarizing Catherine's life and her investigation, and a local minister who had never known Catherine but was moved by her story spoke about courage and justice and the long arc of truth. Ellie had commissioned a bronze plaque, simple and dignified, that was now being mounted on the side of the train car by a local craftsman. And when the cover was pulled away, the words gleamed in the afternoon sun. In memory of Catherine Marie Harper, 1939 to 1963, railway clerk and champion of justice, who gave her life exposing corruption and protecting the truth, her courage lives on. The train car itself, once a tomb of secrets and a symbol of buried crimes, had been transformed by this simple act of remembrance, and Ellie had decided to preserve it permanently, working with the county to designate the site as a historical landmark, a place where people could come to remember not just Catherine, but all those who had fought against corruption and paid the ultimate price. As the ceremony concluded and people began to depart, Ellie remained behind with Ranger, placing her hand on the bronze plaque, feeling the warmth of the metal in the sun. And she spoke quietly to the grandmother she had never known, telling her that justice had finally been served, that her sacrifice had not been in vain, that her son and granddaughter knew the truth and would make sure the world never forgot Catherine Harper's name. 6 months after Richard Hale's conviction, Ellie stood on the same mountain where her journey had begun, but everything had changed. The train car was no longer a forgotten relic, but the centerpiece of something new, something Catherine would have been proud of. The federal government had seized most of the Hale family properties as proceeds of crime, and the subsequent auction had allowed Ellie, with money from a book deal and donations from people moved by Catherine's story, to purchase the surrounding 200 acres, creating a sanctuary in the wilderness where her grandmother had died. She had named it Catherine's Place, a retreat center dedicated to preventing burnout in social workers, journalists, and others who dedicated their lives to fighting injustice, people who risked losing themselves in the work the way Ellie once had, the way Catherine ultimately had. The train car remained untouched, preserved exactly as it had been, the bronze plaque gleaming in the sun, but around it Ellie had built small, simple cabins where people could come to rest, to heal, to remember why they had chosen their difficult paths. The first group of residents had arrived last month, 6 exhausted social workers from across the country who spent their days hiking the mountain trails, sitting in quiet contemplation and sharing their stories around evening fires, and Ellie watched them begin to recover the parts of themselves they had lost, the same recovery she had experienced through this unexpected journey. Ranger, now something of a legend after the media coverage, had become the unofficial mascot of the retreat, his calm presence therapeutic for visitors who needed the grounding comfort of a loyal companion. Daniel visited often, having turned the Flathead County Independent into a respected investigative publication, his coverage of the Hale case winning awards and bringing attention to corruption in small towns across America. And he and Ellie had developed a partnership that was both professional and deeply personal, two people who had faced danger together and emerged stronger. On quiet evenings, Ellie would walk to the train car alone, standing where Catherine had stood 60 years ago, and she would think about the strange path that had led her here, from burned-out social worker seeking escape to the guardian of her grandmother's legacy. And she understood now that she had never been running away from her purpose. She had been running toward it, toward this mountain, toward this truth, toward the realization that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The train car that had cost her $500 had given her everything that mattered, her family's true history, justice for a woman who had been silenced, and a purpose that honored both Catherine's courage and Ellie's own need to make a difference. And as she touched the bronze plaque one more time before heading back to the retreat center, Ranger waiting patiently at her side, she knew that some legacies are not burdens to carry, but gifts to cherish, and the greatest inheritance is not money or property, but the courage to stand for truth, no matter how deeply it has been buried.